When I came back from the hospital, the morning sun fell too bright from my tired eyes. My hands trembled around the handle of my small overnight bag, the one the nurse had packed with my medicines and discharge papers. 11 days. 11 long, endless days surrounded by the sterile white walls of that hospital room. Days filled with the smell of disinfectant and the echo of beeping machines. I had gone in for what the doctors called a routine surgery, but nothing about it felt routine to me. The pain, the fear, the loneliness, they clung to me like a shadow. Every night I stared at the ceiling, waiting for a familiar voice to call, a message to light up my phone, something, anything from my daughter Samantha. But silence was all I got. No calls, no texts, no visits. Even the nurse, a kind older woman named Ruth, started checking my phone every morning, hoping I'd missed a call. I hadn't. "She's probably busy, dear," Ruth had said once, gently tucking the blanket around my legs. I had smiled weakly, pretending that explanation made sense, that being busy could make you forget your own mother lying in a hospital bed, struggling to eat, scared of sleeping too deeply in case she never woke up. When the doctor finally handed me the discharge slip, he smiled and said, "You're strong, Eleanor. You're lucky to have family waiting for you at home." I nodded, forcing a polite laugh, though my chest felt heavy with the truth I didn't want to admit. I wasn't sure anyone was waiting. I sat in the hospital lobby for nearly 20 minutes before realizing no one was coming to pick me up. I watched families hugging, laughing, helping each other out the door, a husband pushing his wife's wheelchair, a son carrying his mother's flowers, a teenage girl showing her grandmother funny videos to make her smile. And then there was me, alone, with a half-eaten apple and a stack of unpaid bills inside my purse. I finally asked a nurse to call me a cab. "Are you sure, dear?" she asked, frowning as she helped me into the wheelchair. "Your daughter isn't coming?" I shook my head. "She must have forgotten," I said softly. The lie tasted bitter. The taxi ride home was silent, except for the hum of the engine and the occasional cough from the driver. I stared out the window, watching the city blur by, each building reminding me how small and unseen I'd become. My neighborhood came into view, the little blue house with white shutters, the garden that had once been my pride, now overgrown with weeds. My heart lifted for a brief second. Home, I thought. Maybe she had just been too busy. Maybe she was inside now. Maybe she had made soup or cleaned my room. Hope can be such a foolish, stubborn thing. When the taxi stopped, I paid the driver with shaky hands and stepped onto the cracked pathway. The key felt strange in my fingers, as though the house itself might reject me. When I pushed the door open, the smell hit me first. Lemon cleaner and something new, something metallic. The house was spotless, almost unnaturally so. My slippers waited neatly by the door, but they looked untouched. I called out, "Sam?" Silence. I tried again, louder this time. "Samantha, I'm home." Still nothing. I took a deep breath, wincing as the stitches along my side tugged painfully, and started toward the kitchen, where I hoped to find her. I imagined she might be cooking or maybe out for groceries. The idea comforted me for a fleeting second, until I stepped into the kitchen and froze. There it was, standing tall, shiny, and alien beside my old beige refrigerator. A second refrigerator. New, metallic silver, twice the size of mine. Its surface gleamed like it didn't belong in this house, reflecting my pale face back at me. For a moment, I thought I'd walked into the wrong home. My hand trembled as I set down my hospital bag. What on earth?" I whispered. The old fridge hummed weakly beside it, its door plastered with family photos and magnets from old vacations, but the new one was spotless. Not a single mark, no fingerprints, no warmth of family life. It stood there like a stranger. I took a hesitant step closer, confusion clouding my mind. Had Samantha bought it for me as a surprise? Maybe she had wanted to make my recovery easier, to store my new diet foods. My heart fluttered with the fragile hope of that thought, the hope of love I still wanted to believe existed between us. Then I heard footsteps, light, hurried, coming from the living room. "Oh, you're back," Samantha said, her tone flat, almost distracted. She held a cup of coffee and her phone in one hand, her hair tied back in a neat bun. She looked healthy, radiant even, the kind of glow that comes from good sleep and no worries. "You thought you'd come tomorrow." Her eyes flicked toward my bag, then toward the fridge. I smiled faintly, trying to bridge the silence. "You got a new refrigerator?" "Yes," she replied simply, taking a sip of coffee. There was no excitement, no warmth in her voice, just a statement of fact. "It's mine," she added after a moment, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I blinked. "Yours?" She nodded. "Yes. I bought it with my own money. Please don't put your stuff in it, Mom. I don't want things getting mixed up again." She said it so casually, so coldly, that I wasn't sure I'd heard her right. My throat went dry. "Getting mixed up again?" I echoed. "Sam, we've never had an issue." "I know," she cut in, "but it's just better this way. You can use the old one. It's fine for your things." For a second, I couldn't breathe. I stared at her, my daughter, my only child, and saw someone I barely recognized. Her words didn't sound cruel, they sounded practical, almost polite, but beneath that tone was something sharp, something that sliced right through me. I wanted to tell her how I thought of her every single night in that hospital bed, how I'd prayed to wake up just to hear her voice again. But I didn't say any of it. I just stood there, staring at the shiny new refrigerator that seemed to hum louder than my own heartbeat. She turned away before I could answer, scrolling through her phone as she left the kitchen. "Glad you're feeling better, Mom," she said over her shoulder. "There's soup in your fridge." My fridge. Not ours. The words echoed in my head like a slow breaking wave. I looked back at the two fridges, one old, tired, full of fading magnets and memories, the other cold, bright, and completely hers. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, my home didn't feel like mine anymore. That night, the house felt unfamiliar, almost haunted, not by ghosts, but by silence. I sat at the kitchen table long after Samantha had gone upstairs. The light above the sink flickered softly, casting uneven shadows across the two refrigerators. Mine hummed weakly, an old soldier still fighting, while hers purred like something alive and proud. I could hear her footsteps above me, the confident rhythm of someone who felt completely at home. But me? I felt like a guest in my own house. Every sound, the ticking of the clock, the whir of the new fridge, the faint buzz from her phone upstairs, felt louder than my heartbeat. I ran my fingers over the rough wooden table, the one her father had built before he passed, and for the first time in years, I felt a pang of something I couldn't name. Maybe loss, maybe regret. I'd imagined this house would always be a place of warmth and laughter, but tonight it felt divided, split right down the middle, like those two fridges, one for her world, one for mine. I opened my old refrigerator to get some milk for tea. The dim yellow light flickered, and I noticed the half-empty shelves. A few eggs, wilted lettuce, a jar of jam. Everything felt smaller, emptier than before. I reached for the carton of milk, only to find it sour. I sighed, shutting the door softly. My stitches pulled again as I leaned against the counter. That sharp pain reminded me I was still healing, not just from the surgery, but from something deeper. When I'd given birth to Samantha, I had promised myself she would never feel the kind of loneliness I grew up with. I worked double shifts, skipped dinners, sold my jewelry to keep her in school. And now, here she was, under my roof, drawing invisible lines I wasn't allowed to cross. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee, the rich, expensive kind I couldn't afford. For a moment, I smiled, thinking she'd made some for both of us. But when I walked into the kitchen, she was already there, sipping from her cup and closing the door of her fridge. She looked up briefly. "Morning," she said. "There's instant coffee if you want." I nodded, forcing a smile, and poured hot water into my cup. The cheap instant mix floated on the surface like brown dust. Across the counter, she was eating strawberries and yogurt, things she used to love sharing with me. The new fridge door gleamed in the light, reflecting her perfect posture, her perfect detachment. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked quietly. "Yeah," she replied, scrolling through her phone. "You?" I hesitated. "Not much. Still sore." She nodded, absently. "No, I'm sorry. No, do you need help?" Just that nod. Polite, distant. After breakfast, she left for work, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving behind a faint trail of perfume. The house sunk into silence again. I tried to distract myself, folding laundry, watering the plants, even sorting through old photos. One picture caught my eye. Samantha, as a little girl, holding a melting ice cream, laughing as I wiped her chin. The same kitchen, years ago. My throat tightened. I placed the photo on the counter beside the new fridge, hoping she might see it when she came home. Maybe it would remind her of who we were once. By afternoon, the pain in my side grew worse. I took my medicine, but when I opened my fridge for water, the bottle was empty. I reached for the cabinet, also empty. I sighed, glancing toward the silver giant beside me. Through its glass door, I could see bottles of sparkling water, rows of fruits, a jug of milk. I hesitated. Would she mind if I took just one bottle? It wasn't stealing. It was our kitchen. I opened the door carefully, the cool air washing over me like relief. I took one bottle and quietly closed it again. That evening, when Samantha came home, her face was calm but her tone sharp. "Did you open my fridge?" I froze. I I just needed some water," I said softly. "Mine was empty." Her eyes narrowed. "Mom, we talked about this. You have your own." I stared at her in disbelief. "It's water, Samantha. I didn't think—" "That's not the point," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You need to respect boundaries. This is exactly why I got my own fridge." Boundaries. The word hit harder than I expected. I wanted to shout, to remind her this was my house, that I raised her here, that every tile, every crack, every memory was mine. But the words never came. Instead, I just nodded, feeling my chest tighten. She sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'm not trying to be mean, Mom. I just like things organized. You know how particular I am." Then she smiled faintly, as if that made everything better. "I'll get you some water tomorrow." That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the small bottle I'd taken. It felt like proof of a crime I hadn't committed. The house creaked softly, the sound of her moving around upstairs. I could hear laughter through her door, a phone call maybe with friends, maybe with someone she loved. It used to be me she called for advice, for comfort. Now I was just the quiet noise downstairs. Before going to bed, I passed by the kitchen again. The two fridges stood side by side, a cruel reflection of the space between us. I ran my fingers across the cold surface of hers, smooth, spotless, untouchable, and whispered, "I hope it keeps you happy, sweetheart." Then I opened mine, took out an apple that had started to wrinkle, and went back to my room. Lying in the dark, I thought about how strange love can become, How the same hands that once held you when you cried can later build walls around themselves. And how the same house that once felt like a haven can start feeling like a cage. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. I was just sad. Sad that something as small as a refrigerator could draw such a clear line between a mother and a child. But deep down, something else began to stir. A quiet, fragile feeling I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was the faint, painful beginning of understanding. The next morning, I awoke to the familiar, dull ache of my side, the memory of the previous day's quiet confrontation still pressing against my chest. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, dancing across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself that Samantha was still adjusting to the changes in my health. After all, 11 days alone in the hospital can make anyone anxious. But as I entered the kitchen, the sight that met me tightened my chest like a vice. Samantha was there again, already at work, her sleeves rolled up and a permanent marker in one hand. On the new fridge, she was meticulously sticking small pink labels across every shelf, each one bearing her name. My stomach sank, and for a moment I simply stood in the doorway holding my small bag of belongings from the hospital, my fingers trembling. This wasn't just organization, this was a declaration, a quiet, humiliating proclamation that this space, this home, was hers. "Good morning," I said softly, attempting to mask the tremor in my voice. Samantha looked up from her work, her eyes cool and precise. "Morning, Mom," she replied, a polite smile on her lips that carried no warmth. I forced myself to step closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "These labels," I began hesitantly. "Why do you feel the need to put your name on every shelf? This is my kitchen too. You don't have to—" She raised her hand slightly, as if to stop me from speaking further. "Mom, this isn't about disrespect. It's about efficiency. Everything has its place. Your things are in your fridge, mine are in mine. It's practical. You wouldn't understand, but I'm just making things easier for everyone." Her words stung more than any accusation could. Practical. Efficiency. It sounded clinical, cold, devoid of the love I had always associated with her. My eyes wandered to the half-empty, aging fridge that had once stored our family meals, the leftovers I'd packed carefully in small containers, the shelves where magnets clung stubbornly despite years of wear. And now the new fridge glimmered like a fortress, as if to say, "You don't belong here." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "Samantha, I've never taken your things, never crossed the line. This isn't necessary." She didn't look up. Her hand moved deliberately, pressing another label firmly onto a shelf. "Mom," she said softly, "it's not about what you've done. It's about what's best for me. I've worked hard for this. I deserve my space. You'll understand when you grow up, or in your case, when you accept your limitations." I froze, the words hanging in the air like a cold wind that had swept through my chest. Limitations. She had never spoken to me like that before, not even during the small quarrels of my youth. Now her voice was firm, unyielding, a sharp reminder that the person I had nurtured, taught, and loved unconditionally had become someone I barely recognized. My hands gripped the counter, knuckles white. I I don't know what to say," I whispered, the first tremor of tears pricking my eyes. Samantha finally looked at me then, her eyes calm, controlled. "Don't take it personally, Mom," she said, placing the marker down and wiping her hands on a towel. "This isn't about you. You have your things, I have mine. It's fair. Everyone should have boundaries, right?" Fair. The word reverberated in my mind like a bell clanging against the hollow wall. Fair. My life, my house, the memories I had built in these rooms. Apparently, fairness had a new definition, and it excluded me. I turned away, retreating slowly, my chest aching as I walked back toward the living room. My body still bore the aches of surgery, my legs still weak from weeks of immobility, and now my heart bore the invisible bruises of betrayal. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake worrying about her, imagining her future, praying she would be safe, happy, and respectful. And now she was marking territory in the very space I had once filled with care, laughter, and guidance. The hours that followed were long and quiet. I avoided the kitchen as much as possible, retreating to my room with a cup of lukewarm tea and a notebook I had kept since my youth.
I wrote small notes, reminders of the things I loved, of memories I wanted to preserve even if no one else acknowledged them. Writing became my silent resistance, a way to hold on to some sense of identity in a space that seemed too determined to erase it. By late afternoon, the house was completely still, the only sound coming from the faint hum of the new fridge and the soft ticking of the clock. I heard her laughter upstairs, the sound of her talking to friends or perhaps a coworker. The casual, carefree tone cut through me like a knife. This was my home, had always been my home, yet I felt as though the walls themselves had shifted, favoring her presence over mine. That evening, when she came down to grab a snack, she passed me without a word, opening the new fridge and carefully taking out a slice of cheese. I wanted to speak, to say something that would remind her of the bond we once had, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I watched her move through the kitchen with an almost ceremonial precision, her every action reinforcing the division she had established. My old fridge hummed faintly beside her, smaller, quieter, almost invisible. And for the first time, I truly felt the weight of invisibility, the realization that the woman I had raised was now drawing lines between us, and that those lines were not easily crossed. I sat down at the table, my hands wrapped around my cup, feeling the cold ceramic against my fingers. The kitchen, the house, the life I had built here. They were mine, yes, but I realized that ownership alone did not guarantee presence or respect. Presence could be withdrawn, and respect could be denied. And for the first time in a long while, I began to understand that love, even when given unconditionally, could be ignored. The night deepened, and with it a quiet resolve began to form within me. The labels, the boundaries, the cold distance, they were not the end. They were a challenge, a test of endurance and patience. I did not yet know how I would respond, but one thing was clear. I would not let this break me entirely. Samantha might control the kitchen, might draw lines across the space that had once been shared, but I still had my memories, my strength, and most importantly, my dignity. And somewhere in the shadows of that tense silence, a faint spark of empowerment began to glow, fragile yet undeniable.
The next morning, I woke before dawn, the familiar ache in my hip reminding me of the fragility of my body. And yet, something in me stirred differently this day. The house was quiet, bathed in the soft gold light of early morning. I moved slowly through the hall, each step measured, careful not to pull at the still healing stitches along my side. When I reached the kitchen, my heart clenched as usual, but instead of sinking into despair, I felt a strange, brittle clarity forming inside me. The new fridge stood there as it always did, gleaming, cold, and imperious. Samantha had already begun her morning routine, organizing shelves with the precision of a general arranging troops, her voice occasionally breaking the silence with small clipped commands into her phone. I watched her from a distance, noting the almost ritualistic care she lavished on every drawer, every compartment. I realized then that this fridge was more than a storage unit to her. It was a fortress, a monument, a visible declaration of dominance. It symbolized the space she believed she owned, not just in the kitchen, but in the home, and perhaps in my life itself. I attempted small gestures of reconciliation. I poured coffee into our matching mugs, placing one carefully beside the old fridge. I had baked a small loaf of bread the day before, just enough for two, and I laid it on the counter, hoping she would notice. Perhaps she would pause for a moment and remember the years we had shared, the long nights I had stayed awake, the sacrifices I had made to ensure her comfort, her education, her happiness. But when she emerged from her room, hair perfectly tied, nails freshly painted, she glazed at the bread, smiled faintly, without enthusiasm, and said, "Thanks, Mom," before opening her fridge and removing a small container of fresh fruit she had bought with her own money. She didn't sit, she didn't linger, and she certainly didn't engage in conversation. It was as if my efforts to connect were invisible, my intentions irrelevant. By midday, the pattern had become unmistakable. Samantha moved through the kitchen with precision, a kind of territorial grace, labeling and organizing, aligning and reinforcing boundaries with every small action.
I wanted to intervene, to say, "This is my home too, my kitchen too." But the words lodged in my throat, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. She was polite, almost unnervingly so, but every polite word carried an undercurrent of control, a subtle insistence that I was now a guest in my own life. She didn't speak loudly, she didn't argue, she simply existed as a constant reminder that her world and mine were no longer aligned. I noticed the shelves she had labeled that morning, the dairy, the fruits, the meats. Each sticker, each careful stroke of the marker was a tiny, humiliating proclamation. Mine, not yours. The day stretched on, heavy with quiet humiliation. I busied myself with small chores, trying to fill the house with activity rather than despair. I cleaned countertops, watered plants, dusted picture frames, and even scrubbed the tiles around the old fridge until my hands were raw. Yet no matter how much I did, it never seemed enough. Samantha would return, glance at my work, and make a small adjustment, a minor correction, as if to silently convey, "I am in the one in control here." I began to understand that her actions were not born of mere organization. They were carefully calculated demonstrations of authority. And worse, I realized I could not stop them. My health limited my movements. My emotions limited my confrontation. I felt trapped in a house that was legally mine, but psychologically hers. By evening, the tension became almost unbearable. I prepared a small dinner, just enough for myself, trying to avoid any conflict. As I carried a plate to the dining room, Samantha emerged from the kitchen carrying a glass of water. She walked past me, her presence commanding and unapologetic, and set the glass down with perfect precision. She didn't speak, she didn't smile, she simply existed as a living reminder that the space had been divided, that the boundaries had been drawn, and that I was expected to obey silently. I wanted to say something, anything, to reclaim even a small part of my dignity, but I didn't. Instead, I ate quietly, tasting both my food and my growing sense of alienation. Later that night, when I attempted to prepare a small snack, I opened the old fridge to find that it was running low. Milk spoiled, vegetables wilting, leftovers dried out. I realized with a sinking heart that the small care I had once taken for my own needs had been overshadowed by Samantha's meticulous control. She hadn't done this maliciously, I knew that, at least not entirely. Yet the effect was the same. I was left with scraps, with remnants of a life that once felt shared, with a quiet hunger not just for food, but for recognition, for acknowledgement, for the warmth that had vanished from my home. I retreated to my room that night, cup of tea in hand, and stared at the ceiling. The weight of betrayal settled deep in my chest, heavy and depressive. Yet amidst the ache and the humiliation, a flicker of resolve began to emerge. If the house was hers now, if she wished to mark every inch of space with her labels and her rules, then I would not break. I would not disappear. I would endure, quietly but deliberately, biding my time, gathering strength, and remembering the life I had built, the dignity I still possessed, and the knowledge that true power did not always reside in the loudest, coldest voice. As I lay in bed, my mind drifted to memories of Samantha as a child, her laughter echoing through these same halls, the way she had clung to me during thunderstorms, the nights we stayed up talking about her dreams and fears. Those memories were mine still, untouchable, indelible. And in that quiet, painful reflection, I felt the faintest spark of something powerful, awareness. Awareness that even in the face of deliberate distance, manipulation, and humiliation, I had a voice, a claim, and a strength that could not be labeled, shelved, or dismissed. The house could belong to her in appearance, the fridge could belong to her in form, but my spirit, my dignity, and my claim to this life remained intact, quietly simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to assert itself.
The days that followed became a careful dance of avoidance and silent observation. Each morning, Samantha would glide into the kitchen with the air of someone reclaiming territory she believed was hers by right. adjusting shelves, relabeling containers, and meticulously aligning every bottle and carton inside her refrigerator. I tried to stay out of her way, sticking to the edges of the kitchen or retreating to my room. Yet every movement I made seemed to draw her attention. One morning, she even left a small handwritten note on the counter. "Mom, please don't touch anything in my fridge. Thank you." The words were polite, almost charmingly so, yet they carried a sting I could not ignore. It wasn't the words themselves, but the assertion behind them. The silent implication that my presence, my needs, my life in this house was secondary. Each label she placed, each note she left, each careful adjustment of her perfectly organized shelves was a reminder that the house I had built, the kitchen I had maintained for decades, was no longer my own. I found myself waking earlier each day, not just to manage my physical pain, but to prepare myself emotionally for the encounters that awaited. I cleaned my old fridge until its shelves gleamed, rearranged the cabinets, and organized my own modest supplies, trying to reclaim even the smallest semblance of order. Yet every effort felt futile when I would turn and see her fridge, its doors closed and gleaming like an impenetrable wall. She had stocked it with expensive cheeses, imported fruits, and delicate pastries, all bought with her own money, she reminded me more than once, as if wealth somehow validated her claim. Watching her move around the kitchen with quiet authority, it became painfully clear that Samantha's sense of entitlement had grown as large as the refrigerator itself. One afternoon, I attempted a small gesture of connection. I had made a pot of vegetable soup, hoping to share a warm meal with her, to remind her of the bond we once shared. I carried the bowl carefully into the kitchen and placed it on the counter beside her pristine fridge. Samantha glanced at it, her brow rising slightly, and then reached for a prepackaged snack from her own fridge. "Thanks, Mom," she said without enthusiasm, taking her snack and moving toward the living room. She didn't sit, she didn't linger, and she didn't acknowledge the soup I had prepared. My hands shook as I set the bowl back on the counter, realizing that no matter how much I tried to reach her, the barrier she had constructed was absolute. It wasn't just a fridge anymore. It was a symbol of everything she had decided I could no longer touch, control, or influence. The emotional weight began to press on me more heavily each day. I started noticing small acts of deliberate exclusion. The old fridge would be stocked sparsely, with items that were either near their expiration or already partially spoiled. Samantha would comment casually, as if nothing were wrong. "Oh, I thought you didn't like these," when in reality, she had purchased them knowing I would have no choice but to consume them. She began moving the snacks I used to enjoy, chocolates, crackers, fresh fruit, to her fridge, labeling everything meticulously. Every shelf became a line drawn between us, and every label was a quiet assertion of dominance. I realized then that she wasn't just separating food, she was separating our lives, creating a hierarchy where she occupied the center and I hovered on the periphery. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, I attempted a small gesture of connection. I had made a pot of vegetable soup, hoping to share a warm meal with her, to remind her of the bond we once shared. I carried the bowl carefully into the kitchen and placed it on the counter beside her pristine fridge. Samantha glanced at it, her brow rising slightly, and then reached for a pre-packaged snack from her own fridge. "Thanks, Mom," she said without enthusiasm, taking her snack and moving toward the living room. She didn't sit, she didn't linger, and she didn't acknowledge the soup I had prepared. My hands shook as I set the bowl back on the counter, realizing that no matter how much I tried to reach her, the barrier she had constructed was absolute. It wasn't just a fridge anymore. It was a symbol of everything she had decided I could no longer touch, control, or influence. The first time I began to see a path not just for survival, but for quiet resistance. Samantha could claim the kitchen,
claim the fridge, claim the superficial markers of dominance, but she could not claim my history, my memories, my mind, or my dignity. These were unlabelable, untouchable, and unconquerable. I began planning small acts of subtle assertion, nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational, simply ways to remind her, and perhaps myself, that I was still here, still present, still a force in this home, even if she refused to acknowledge it. As sleep finally claimed me, I held on to that fragile ember, that small sense of empowerment that had begun to form amidst the humiliation and emotional distance. I realized that while Samantha had taken control of the kitchen, she had not taken control of me. And in that realization, bitter though it was, lay the first glimmer of hope. A quiet understanding.
The following morning, I awoke earlier than usual, my body still tender from surgery, but my mind strangely alert. The house was silent, wrapped in the soft, golden light of dawn, and I felt a growing determination mingling with the dull ache in my side. I knew today would be another test, another day of navigating Samantha's quiet but unyielding assertion of control. I moved through the hallway slowly, taking care with each step, as though every movement might betray the delicate balance between endurance and confrontation I had begun to cultivate. The kitchen, bathed in the soft glow of morning light, revealed the same scene I had come to expect. The shiny new fridge stood like a monument to her authority, labels affixed neatly to every shelf, each one a reminder that I was no longer the center of this home. Samantha emerged moments later, hair tied back perfectly, her posture impeccable, her expression serene but unreadable. She glanced at me briefly as she sipped her coffee and then opened her fridge with careful precision. "Morning, Mom," she said without enthusiasm. "Everything organized?" I nodded quietly, trying to hide the mixture of hurt and simmering determination that rose within me. I realized then that these small, everyday encounters, the casual greeting, the brief glance, the deliberate act of controlling space, were not just acts of control. They were psychological maneuvers, and I, weak and healing though I might be, could not allow her to win. I poured myself a cup of tea, the steam curling gently above the rim of the mug, and made my way to the counter. I carefully set down a small plate of toast, buttered lightly as though inviting her to join me. Samantha glanced at the plate but said nothing. Her focus returned to her perfectly arranged fridge. She removed a small container of fresh fruit, ignoring my offering completely. A pang of loneliness swept through me, but I held it at bay, reminding myself that patience and subtlety were my allies. This was no longer about casual neglect. It was about asserting my presence in a world where I had been deliberately minimized. I would need strategy, not anger. By mid-morning, Samantha had begun her ritual of labeling and organizing once again. I watched her from a distance, noting every movement, the careful alignment of jars, the precise placement of utensils, the unwavering gaze as she ensured her system was perfect. I felt the familiar sting of humiliation as I realized that these actions were deliberate, a way to mark territory, not just physically, but emotionally. The kitchen, the very heart of the home, had become a battlefield of quiet power, and she was waging her war with meticulous efficiency. But unlike before, I was no longer merely a passive observer. I had begun to recognize patterns, to anticipate her movements, to plan small, deliberate interventions that would assert my own presence without provoking outright confrontation. That afternoon, I attempted a subtle act of reclamation. I had noticed that one of the shelves in the old fridge was nearly empty. The lettuce had wilted, the milk had turned, and the eggs were cracked. I took a small trip to the corner store, purchasing fresh vegetables and a carton of milk, and returned to restock the fridge carefully. As I arranged the items, I realized that this act was not just about nourishment. It was a declaration of care,
of continuity, of the life I had built here long before Samantha had claimed dominance. The act was quiet, unassuming, yet profoundly symbolic. I was still here. I still mattered. I still had a claim to this home that could not be erased by labels or organization. Later that evening, Samantha came home, her steps purposeful, her presence commanding as always. I noticed a subtle change in her demeanor, a slight pause as she approached the old fridge, a fleeting expression of curiosity, perhaps even mild surprise, at the sight of the restocked shelves. She did not comment, she did not accuse, but for the first time, I sensed a crack in her seamless armor of control. I realized that while she could dominate the kitchen, she could not erase the history, the effort, and the love embedded in every corner of the space. The old fridge, humble and worn, became a symbol of resilience, my quiet, unyielding assertion that despite her dominance, my presence could not be fully negated. That night, as I prepared for bed, I reflected on the day's small victories and quiet confrontations. The labels, the boundaries, the deliberate acts of exclusion, they had not changed my fundamental truth that I was still the mother, the keeper of memories, the silent witness to the life we had shared. And with that recognition came a small but potent sense of empowerment. I realized that revenge need not be loud or aggressive. It could be subtle, patient, strategic. By quietly asserting my presence, maintaining my dignity, and refusing to vanish into the background, I could reclaim not just the kitchen, but a measure of control over my own life and emotional well-being. The night deepened, and with it, a quiet resolve settled over me. Samantha could continue to claim the kitchen, to dominate the fridge, to mark territory with meticulous labels and silent declarations. But I had begun to reclaim my agency in ways she could not foresee. I had begun to understand the power of subtlety, of quiet endurance, of acts of care and assertion that spoke louder than anger ever could. As I laid in bed, the soft hum of the refrigerators blending into the background, I felt a fragile but undeniable sense of hope, a hope that one day the boundary she had drawn would not signify exclusion, but a test, a challenge that I was ready to meet with dignity, patience, and the quiet strength of someone who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger on the other side.
The following morning, the house felt unusually still. I moved through the hallway with deliberate care, each step slow, measured, mindful of my stitches and the lingering weakness from my recovery. But beneath the physical pain, a new energy coursed quietly through me, a sense that I could reclaim parts of my life without confrontation, without drama, without needing Samantha to acknowledge me. Today, the kitchen would not be a battlefield. It would be my classroom of subtle strategy, my stage for quiet empowerment. I poured a cup of tea, the warm liquid grounding me, and approached my old fridge with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in days. It was no longer just an appliance. It was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in a space dominated by someone else, one could assert presence, care, and dignity. Samantha arrived soon after, her steps precise, her demeanor confident. She carried her usual coffee and a stack of labels, clearly planning her morning routine of meticulous organization. But I was ready. I had spent the early hours thinking through small, deliberate ways to assert my agency without provoking her. I placed a small handwritten note atop the old fridge, a gentle invitation rather than a confrontation. Mom space, fresh milk, fresh bread, love included. It was subtle, yet meaningful, a reminder that I was not invisible. I returned to my tea, watching her approach. She glanced at the note, her brow slightly furrowing, a faint ripple of curiosity crossing her composed expression. I didn't speak, didn't explain. I let the note do the work. It was a small act of quiet rebellion, one that carried dignity and intention rather than anger. Throughout the morning, I began incorporating more subtle acts of assertion. I cleaned, restocked, and organized my space in ways that were visible but non-confrontational. I made sure the old fridge contained fresh, nourishing items, the milk I could now afford, fruits I knew Samantha would never prioritize, small comforts I had always enjoyed. I arranged them neatly, carefully, ensuring that the visual impact was clear without being aggressive. I was reclaiming my space, not through force, but through presence and attention to detail. Every small act became a signal. I was here. I mattered. And this was still my home as much as it was hers. Samantha moved through the kitchen with her usual precision, yet I noticed subtle shifts in her behavior. She paused longer by the old fridge, hesitated before opening a drawer in her own, and occasionally glanced toward the notes and arrangements I had made. Her movements, once fluid and unchallenged, now carried slight uncertainty. It was not dominance lost, not yet, but recognition, a subtle awareness that I was not disappearing into the background as she had assumed. Each glance, each hesitation, fueled a quiet satisfaction within me, a reminder that influence need not be loud to be effective. By afternoon, I had begun to notice patterns in Samantha's behavior, the way she labeled, the order she prioritized, the hours she spent ensuring perfection in her space. I realized I could anticipate her routines and subtly insert my own acts of presence without direct confrontation. I prepared small meals, baked lightly scented bread, left flowers on the counter near the old fridge, and ensured that the space carried signs of life, warmth, and memory. The old fridge, once overlooked and neglected, now hummed with subtle vitality. The contrast between the sterile perfection of her fridge and the lived-in warmth of mine became increasingly apparent, and I began to sense the psychological impact on Samantha. She was precise, yes, but her space now felt clinical. Mine felt alive, intentional, and filled with the subtle power of continuity and care. That evening, Samantha came home later than usual. I had prepared a small cup of tea and placed it beside the old fridge, along with a slice of the bread I had baked earlier. She paused at the sight, her brow raising slightly, and she glanced at me for the first time with an expression that carried more curiosity than indifference. "Bread?" she asked, her voice soft. I nodded. "Fresh, just baked," I said quietly. She didn't take it, didn't sit, but the hesitation in her movement was a small victory. For the first time in days, she had acknowledged my presence in a subtle but undeniable way. I realized that this was the power I had been seeking: quiet, dignified acknowledgement that did not require argument or anger. As the night settled, I reflected on the day's small victories. I had not demanded respect. I had not confronted her outright, and yet I had reclaimed a measure of agency. The act of preparation, of attention to detail, of subtle, deliberate assertion had shifted the dynamics of the household. Samantha remained in control in some areas, but my presence was now undeniable, a quiet, dignified force that could not be erased by labels, fridges, or silent authority. I understood that true empowerment lay not in dominating others, but in claiming one's own space, one's own dignity, and one's own narrative. Before going to bed, I walked through the kitchen one last time. The two fridges stood side by side, the new one gleaming, labels neat and precise, the old one modest, warm, and carefully stocked with life and attention. I placed a small handwritten note atop my fridge, a declaration without confrontation, a statement of presence,
a reminder that dignity could coexist with endurance. And as I lay in bed that night, the soft hum of the refrigerators blending into the quiet, I felt a spark of hope. A spark that told me, though Samantha might control the kitchen and attempt to dominate the space, she could not dominate me. I could endure, assert, and in my own subtle way, reclaim both dignity and influence. The ember of empowerment glowed quietly, fueled by patience, observation, and careful strategy. I knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt a sense of agency I had not experienced in days. The house, the fridges, the labels, they were all symbols of a struggle that could not be won by brute force. Influence, dignity, and recognition could be quietly cultivated, nurtured, and asserted, and in that knowledge lay a power that even Samantha could not extinguish. The evening faded into night, and with it came a deep sense of resolve. Tomorrow would be another day, another opportunity to quietly reclaim my life, assert my dignity, and subtly, invisibly remind Samantha that while she may control the kitchen, she would never control me.
The next morning, the house was alive with the faint sounds of dawn, birds outside, the soft hum of the old fridge, and the distant rustle of Samantha moving about upstairs. I rose slowly, mindful of my healing body, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Today would not be about retreat or passive observation. Today would be about quiet assertion. I moved through the hallway and into the kitchen, carrying a basket of fresh fruit and a small bouquet of wildflowers I had picked from the garden. I arranged them carefully on the counter near my fridge, taking care to make the display visible yet tasteful, deliberate yet unprovocative. Each detail mattered: the placement of the strawberries, the slight tilt of the vase, the alignment of the oranges. It was subtle, but I knew it would not go unnoticed. Samantha arrived shortly after, her presence commanding, her steps precise and deliberate. She carried her coffee, as always, and immediately reached for her labels and marker, as if to reinforce her authority over the space. I watched silently, my posture calm, my gaze steady. She paused mid-step, catching sight of the carefully arranged fruit and flowers. For a brief moment, her expression faltered, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even unease. She said nothing, merely adjusted her path slightly, moving around my display with the subtle caution that had never been there before. I realized that my small, deliberate act of care had disrupted the seamless control she had maintained over the kitchen. Throughout the morning, I continued my quiet interventions. I baked a small loaf of bread, arranged teacups neatly, and left subtle reminders of the home's history: photographs on the counter, small trinkets, and a few handwritten notes tucked beside the fruit bowl. Each act was deliberate, a quiet reminder of my presence, of my role in this house, of the life I had built here long before Samantha had asserted her dominance. I did not speak, I did not challenge. I simply existed, asserting my dignity through presence, care, and intentionality. By midday, the effect was undeniable. Samantha moved through the kitchen with her usual precision, but her steps were now measured, her eyes occasionally flicking toward my carefully curated spaces. She adjusted her own fridge with slightly less confidence, her hands lingering over the labels as if second-guessing their necessity. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt the shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of my presence, a recognition that I would not be erased, no matter how meticulously she had tried to mark her territory. That afternoon, I decided to take another small but deliberate step. I prepared a simple lunch, a sandwich with fresh vegetables, a cup of herbal tea, and a small piece of cake, and placed it on the dining table. I left the kitchen, allowing the aroma and arrangement to speak for themselves. When Samantha returned, she paused at the table, glanced at the food, and for the first time, hesitated before reaching for her own snack from the new fridge. She looked at me, and though she said nothing, her expression held a faint trace of curiosity, perhaps even admiration.
I realized then that subtlety, patience, and quiet intention were beginning to unsettle her seamless control. As evening approached, the house settled into a calm, almost reverent quiet. I moved through the kitchen, straightening utensils, wiping countertops, and leaving small gestures of care: a cup left warm on the counter, a folded napkin, and a fresh flower tucked beside the old fridge. Each act was deliberate, visible, and intentional, a quiet but undeniable assertion of my presence and dignity. Samantha moved through the space with less certainty now, occasionally pausing, her movements slightly less fluid, her confidence subtly undermined by the presence I had reasserted. That night, I reflected on the day's events as I prepared for bed. The kitchen, once a battlefield of labels and silent dominance, had become a stage for quiet strategy, subtle influence, and deliberate empowerment. Samantha's arrogance and control had not been shattered, not yet, but they had been gently challenged, undermined by patience, intentionality, and the quiet force of presence. I realized that power did not always need to be loud, confrontational, or aggressive. It could be cultivated through care, dignity, and subtle assertion, reshaping the dynamics without open conflict. Before sleep claimed me, I walked through the kitchen one last time, pausing at the old fridge. I ran my hand gently across the cool metal, feeling the hum of life within. The carefully arranged fruit, the bouquet of flowers, the small notes, they were more than objects. They were symbols of resilience, of agency, of quiet empowerment. I smiled faintly to myself, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to assert my presence, reclaim my space, and quietly, steadily, remind Samantha that while she may have claimed the kitchen, she could never claim my dignity, my memories, or my place in this home. The hum of the refrigerators, the soft flicker of the kitchen light, and the gentle whisper of my own heartbeat filled the room as I turned toward my bedroom. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of quiet triumph, a bittersweet victory rooted not in confrontation or anger, but in strategy, patience, and the unshakable knowledge that presence, dignity, and intention are forms of power even the most controlling individual cannot fully erase. The night settled around me like a soft blanket, and with it came a sense of empowerment, fragile yet undeniable, ready to grow stronger with each small, deliberate act of assertion in the days to come.
By the ninth day since my return from the hostel, the house had settled into an uneasy rhythm, a dance between Samantha's meticulous control and my deliberate, quiet assertion of presence. Each morning, I moved through the kitchen carefully, tending to my old fridge, arranging fresh food, and leaving small notes of warmth, gentle reminders of my history in this home, my care, and my quiet resilience. Samantha continued her routine as well, labeling every shelf, aligning each container with precision, and moving through her domain with unwavering authority. Yet I noticed subtle hesitations, tiny cracks in her seamless demeanor, almost imperceptible but undeniable. A lingering glance at my freshly arranged fruit, a pause before opening a drawer, the faint tilt of her brow as she noticed small notes I had left. These signs, small as they were, became a source of quiet satisfaction and encouragement, a reminder that my presence could no longer be ignored or diminished. I began to experiment with subtle strategies to assert my influence further. I baked lightly scented bread, prepared tea with pear, and left small touches around the kitchen. A neatly folded napkin here, a fresh flower there, a small handwritten note tucked by the old fridge. I did not seek confrontation. I sought presence, visibility, and gentle assertion. Each act carried significance. They were reminders of the life I had cultivated here long before Samantha's dominance, markers of continuity and care that could not be erased by labels or cold metal. I realized that quiet, consistent effort was beginning to unsettle her control in ways she could not fully articulate, though she felt them in the subtle shifts of the kitchen's energy. Midday brought a particularly meaningful moment. Samantha reached for a container in her fridge, but paused, her eyes briefly scanning the counter near mine, where a plate of fresh fruit, a small cup of tea, and a handwritten note awaited her.
She did not acknowledge it verbally, yet her hesitation, the faint flicker of surprise in her eyes, was enough to signal a shift. For the first time, I understood that influence did not require confrontation. It could be exerted through presence, care, and intention. My small acts of nurturing were quietly asserting my authority in the household, reshaping the dynamics without conflict, without anger, and without drama. As afternoon descended into evening, I reflected on the quiet victories of the day. The old fridge hummed with life, stocked and cared for, in ways that contrasted sharply with the sterile precision of Samantha's new appliance. Her dominance was still visible, her label still present, her space still immaculate, yet the warmth, intention, and subtle authority I had cultivated could not be ignored. I noticed small changes in her behavior. She moved more deliberately, her eyes lingered a moment longer on my domain, and she occasionally hesitated before touching her perfectly aligned containers. These were subtle signs of acknowledgement, evidence that my quiet strategies were beginning to leave an imprint on her perception and on the household. Later, I prepared a small lunch and arranged it near the old fridge, leaving a note simply stating, "A little care for those who remember home." Samantha glanced at it briefly, her lips pressing together, but she said nothing. Still, I could sense a shift, a moment of reflection, perhaps, even recognition, in the way she moved about the kitchen afterward. I realized that the quiet persistence of presence, patience, and subtle assertion could challenge dominance in a way confrontation could not. Samantha might control the labels, the shiny new fridge, and the visible markers of authority, but she could not erase my history, my care, or the quiet power I had cultivated in my space. That night, as I prepared for bed, I walked through the kitchen one last time. The juxtaposition of the two fridges, her gleaming, meticulously labeled one, and my modest, warmly cared for old one, told the story of our silent struggle. Samantha's dominance was evident, but my quiet resilience had created its own presence, one that was both visible and intangible, subtle yet impossible to dismiss. I understood that the real victory lay not in confrontation, not in anger, but in deliberate persistence, quiet influence, and dignified presence. The soft hum of the refrigerators became a symbol of coexistence, imperfect yet meaningful, and I felt a fragile but undeniable sense of empowerment growing within me. I lay in bed that night, reflecting on the subtle transformations of the past days. Samantha's arrogance and attempts at control had not been eradicated, but they had been gently challenged by my patience, strategy, and quiet assertion. I understood that power could exist in many forms, not just in dominance or aggression, but in presence, care, and intention. Every small act I had undertaken, each note, each gesture, each carefully arranged object, had shifted the dynamics in ways she could not erase. My dignity, my agency, and my quiet influence were intact, growing stronger with each passing day. And for the first time since my return from the hospital, I felt a deep sense of quiet triumph amidst the lingering pain of exclusion and betrayal. The night settled around the house like a soft blanket, and I felt a sense of readiness, a readiness to continue this delicate dance, to maintain my presence, and to quietly assert my dignity without anger, without confrontation, and without compromise. Samantha could maintain her precise control, but she could not erase the life I had cultivated here, the care I had invested, or the quiet strength that had begun to define my existence in this space. I closed my eyes with a growing confidence, knowing that the true empowerment of this journey was not in overt victory, but in the patient, deliberate assertion of presence, care, and dignity. A power that no labels, no refrigerators, and no arrogance could ever take from me. The days had passed in a rhythm, both predictable and revealing. Samantha maintained her meticulous routines, her labels, her organized compartments. Yet beneath the precision, I sensed a subtle shift. I had continued my quiet strategy, small acts of care and presence that were deliberate, visible, yet entirely non-confrontational. Fresh fruits, neatly folded napkins, carefully prepared teas, small handwritten notes.
These were my instruments, subtle but undeniable markers of resilience and dignity. I had discovered a strength I had forgotten existed, the power of patience, observation, and deliberate action. No longer was I merely reacting to her dominance, I was influencing, reshaping, asserting in ways she could not fully control or dismiss. One morning, I prepared breakfast, arranging a plate of warm toast, sliced fruits, and a cup of tea near the old fridge. I left the table for a moment to retrieve a small notebook, a personal journal I had begun keeping again, and when I returned, Samantha had paused, frozen almost, staring at the display. I did not confront her. I did not speak. I simply smiled faintly and returned to my seat. She adjusted slightly, almost imperceptibly, before taking a seat at her own table. The pause, the hesitation, the brief acknowledgement, it was all a small but meaningful victory. I realized then that influence need not be loud, that quiet dignity and intentional action could unsettle even the most controlled individual. By afternoon, I noticed a subtle change in her behavior. Samantha moved through the kitchen with less certainty, her hands lingering longer over the labels, her steps more measured. I had not changed anything in her space. The act of quietly asserting my own presence in my domain, the old fridge, the counter, the small arrangements of fruit and flowers, had shifted the psychological balance. For the first time, I realized that control could be contested without aggression, that respect and acknowledgement could be nurtured through subtlety, patience, and the deliberate reclamation of one's space and dignity. That evening, I prepared a small cup of tea and left it on the counter beside my fridge, along with a plate of freshly baked cookies. Samantha entered, paused, glanced at the arrangement, and for the first time spoke in a tone that carried more warmth than her usual detached politeness. "You've been busy, Mom," she said, almost in admiration. I did not respond verbally. I simply nodded, acknowledging her recognition through calm presence and quiet confidence. The exchange was small, almost imperceptible, yet monumental. For the first time in days, she had shifted from dominance to acknowledgement, from assertion to observation, and it was a subtle but undeniable triumph. As night approached, I reflected on the journey these past days had taken me through, the pain of surgery, the humiliation of exclusion, the daily reminders of Samantha's arrogance and entitlement. All of it had been a crucible, forging a resilience I had almost forgotten I possessed. I realized that empowerment was not always about confrontation, nor was it about reclaiming control with force or anger. True empowerment could be quiet, strategic, patient, and deliberate. It could exist in the arrangement of fruit, the care in a cup of tea, the placement of a small handwritten note, subtle, unassuming, yet impossible to ignore. The house, once a place of humiliation and exclusion, had transformed under my quiet influence. The old fridge hummed with life, the counters reflected intentionality and care, and the small personal touches I had introduced were visible markers of my presence and dignity. Samantha still maintained her organized domain, but the stark divide between her sterile, precise fridge and the warm, lived-in space I had nurtured was increasingly apparent. My presence was no longer passive, no longer invisible. It was active, strategic, and undeniably influential, even without confrontation. As I prepared for bed, I walked through the kitchen one last time, pausing to admire the subtle victories of the day. The old fridge, modest but cared for, symbolized resilience, dignity, and quiet empowerment. The carefully arranged fruit, the small handwritten notes, the warm cup of tea, they were markers of agency, reminders that I had reclaimed space without anger, without conflict, and with subtle but undeniable authority. I felt a sense of satisfaction, quiet but profound, knowing that my strategy was working, that my dignity was intact, and that my influence, though subtle, was beginning to reshape the dynamics in ways Samantha could not fully comprehend. Lying in bed that night, I reflected on the emotional journey these past days had taken me through. The betrayal, the exclusion, the subtle humiliations, they had tested me, pushed me to the edge, forced me to confront my own vulnerability and resilience.
And in doing so, I discovered an inner strength I had long forgotten I possessed. I realized that while Samantha had attempted to dominate the kitchen, the home, and the space we shared, she could not dominate my mind, my dignity, or the quiet power I had nurtured. The ember of empowerment burned steadily, growing brighter with each deliberate act of presence and assertion. I understood finally that the house, the fridges, the labels, they were symbols, not absolutes. Samantha could maintain her precise control over her space, but she could not erase the history, the love, the care, or the dignity embedded in mine. I had reclaimed more than space. I had reclaimed agency, strategy, and subtle influence. And in that realization lay a bittersweet sense of triumph. I had endured humiliation. I had been excluded, yet I had emerged stronger, wiser, and more empowered than before. The night settled around me, quiet and still, and with it came the profound understanding that while control can be asserted through dominance, true influence and empowerment grow quietly, patiently, and with unwavering dignity.
The morning light spilled through the curtains in soft golden streaks, illuminating the kitchen with a warmth that felt almost symbolic. I moved through the space deliberately, taking in the arrangement of the old fridge, the carefully placed fruits, the small handwritten notes, and the subtle touches of care I had introduced over the past days. Each object, each detail was a testament to endurance, resilience, and quiet empowerment. Samantha was in her usual place, her precise movements almost ritualistic as she tended to her newly organized fridge. Yet for the first time, I noticed a flicker in her demeanor, a hesitation, a subtle acknowledgement that the space I nurtured was not empty, not insignificant, and not invisible. The realization gave me a profound sense of quiet triumph. I understood that though she still maintained dominance in appearance, the emotional and psychological control she had sought over me had been quietly, irrevocably challenged. I prepared breakfast slowly, intentionally arranging a small plate of freshly baked bread, a cup of warm tea, and a slice of fruit tart near the old fridge. The aroma filled the air, soft and comforting, as if the kitchen itself had been infused with warmth and life. Samantha paused, her brow lifting slightly, her gaze lingering on the display. She did not speak immediately, nor did she offer acknowledgement through words, but her pause, subtle yet deliberate, was enough. It was a recognition of my presence, my persistence, and the care I had woven into this space. The dynamic between us had shifted in ways she could not fully articulate, but I could see it, feel it, and understand it. My quiet assertion had begun to leave an indelible mark. As the day unfolded, I continued my deliberate acts of influence. I tidied my own space, replenished the old fridge with fresh ingredients, and placed small reminders of memory and warmth around the kitchen. I realized that these gestures were more than symbolic. They were strategic. They demonstrated that dignity, agency, and care could coexist with endurance. I did not need to demand respect nor to confront Samantha directly. The power I wielded was subtle, yet undeniable. It was rooted in presence, intention, and the quiet cultivation of influence. With each small act, I reminded both of us, and myself, that space could be shared without erasing history, that agency could exist quietly but powerfully. Later that afternoon, Samantha moved through the kitchen with her usual precision. Yet her movements were no longer as fluid, as automatic, or as unchallenged as they had been. She adjusted her labels more cautiously, paused longer by the old fridge, and for the first time, occasionally glanced at me with something approaching curiosity rather than detached authority. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly significant. I had not confronted her with anger. I had not demanded acknowledgement. I had simply persisted, asserted, and nurtured my space in quiet, deliberate ways. And in doing so, I had reclaimed not just the physical domain, but the emotional and psychological equilibrium that she had sought to disrupt. By evening, the house felt transformed. Not in appearance, for the fridges remained side by side, gleaming in their respective orders, but in energy. The kitchen, once a battlefield of dominance and exclusion,
now reflected a delicate balance of presence, resilience, and dignity. I prepared a small cup of tea and placed it near the old fridge, along with a fresh slice of bread and a single flower tucked beside the plate. Samantha paused, glanced at the arrangement, and for the first time offered a faint, genuine smile, a wordless acknowledgement that conveyed recognition, if not reconciliation. I felt a bittersweet satisfaction. The victory was quiet, subtle, and incomplete, yet it was mine. I had endured exclusion, humiliation, and deliberate arrogance, and I had emerged empowered, strategic, and emotionally resilient. As night fell, I walked through the kitchen one final time, pausing to observe the juxtaposition of the two fridges. Samantha's gleaming, labeled compartments reflected her precision and dominance. My old, modest fridge reflected resilience, care, and quiet assertion. Both existed in the same space, side by side, divided yet coexisting, much like our relationship. The contrast was sharp, yet it symbolized balance, the coexistence of control and dignity, dominance and subtle empowerment. I realized then that the essence of power lay not in erasing others, but in asserting oneself quietly, strategically, and with unwavering dignity. My presence, though silent, had become undeniable, shaping the household in ways Samantha could not erase. Before bed, I sat by the window, holding my cup of tea, reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. The bitterness of betrayal and exclusion lingered, yet it was tempered by the quiet satisfaction of endurance and subtle triumph. I understood that empowerment could be quiet, patient, and strategic, rooted not in confrontation, but in consistent, deliberate assertion. I had reclaimed my dignity, my presence, and my influence, and though the emotional reconciliation with Samantha remained incomplete, I felt a profound sense of mastery over my own life. The house, once a symbol of exclusion and dominance, had become a testament to resilience, patience, and quiet victory. As I prepared to sleep, the soft hum of the refrigerators blended with the evening stillness, a gentle reminder of the coexistence we had achieved, imperfect yet meaningful. Samantha's fridge remained gleaming, her labels precise. The old fridge remained humble yet vibrant, stocked with care, warmth, and intention. And in that coexistence, I found empowerment, bittersweet, subtle, and undeniable. I had been excluded, belittled, and minimized, yet I had emerged with quiet strength, agency, and dignity intact. The journey had been painful, but it had forged resilience. I closed my eyes with a sense of hope and quiet triumph, knowing that while dominance may assert itself, true empowerment endures patiently, strategically, and with unwavering grace.